Welcome to our program, Professor Bronk.
Thank you for having me.
I would like to begin our discussions with recent Ukrainian attack on Russia. Ukrainian armed forces of Ukraine have attacked Russia's Engels 2 strategic aviation airfield. Also have successfully struck the oil depots of this airfield. Do you feel that such attacks with Ukrainian drones and Western British Storm Shadow cruise missiles could really force Vladimir Putin to the negotiation table?
I don't think that the attacks on targets in Russia are likely to force the leadership in the Kremlin to negotiate, at least in themselves. What they have done so far is make a significant contribution to particularly reducing the quantity of glide bombs that are launched against Ukrainian forces each day. And we've seen a quite significant decrease in the number of glide bombs over the last month or two. That is primarily because of the successful threat that Ukrainian long-range drones and to some degree ATACMS and Storm Shadow missile strikes have been able to pose to Russian airfields relatively close to Ukraine's borders. The threat that those long-range strikes has entailed on Russian air bases has forced the Russian aerospace forces to move a significantly higher proportion of their aircraft to bases far away from Ukraine, and only station a small number of jets at any given time at the bases close to Ukraine, which means that in general terms, there are fewer aircraft able to conduct fewer sorties for any given amount of daylight and flying time. And so that, I think, is the primary effect that has been achieved in battlefield terms by the Ukrainian long-range strikes. And they've also caused some significant damage to Russian petrochemical refining capability. Clearly, Russia has a huge amount of petrochemical refining capability. But given that Russia is essentially run by the oligarchic group of security and industrial oligarchs around Vladimir Putin, the fact that the Ukrainian drone campaign is hitting oil and gas refineries in particular will be personally affecting the finances of some of the real leadership in Russia, and therefore, as part of a wider strategy, may have some effect on their willingness to look at a negotiated solution.
Also, recently, Russia has launched another air attack on Ukraine and has targeted Ukrainian energy grid. From your perspective, how can you assess the effectiveness of this attack? Because Russia has tried to destroy Ukraine's anti-aircraft system, but it seems like Russia's attacks are fully repelled by the Ukrainian Air Force.
I think it's probably fair to say that the threat to the Ukrainian power grid is the greatest it has been in the 3 years of the full-scale war so far, partly because the damage that was done to the Ukrainian power grid in autumn and winter 2022 and then autumn and winter 2023 was not fully repaired despite the enormous efforts of both Ukrainian workers and, of course, also some foreign partnership arrangements. So each year, Russia has been attacking a slightly weakened system in aggregate. So we're seeing the threat continue to increase of sort of large-scale blackouts. It's certainly true that Ukraine has increased its capability to intercept particularly Shahed or Garan type one-way attack UAVs. The acoustic sensor network is particularly effective in providing tracking information of those UAV and cruise missile as well, flight paths as they travel across Ukrainian territory, which has significantly improved the ability of the mobile air defense teams to be in the right position and be ready with relatively short-range systems, including obviously machine guns and cannon, man-portable air defense systems like Igla or Stinger, and more recently, some very successful UAV-type interceptors, so first-person view type UAVs, or in effect types of propeller-powered missiles that are much cheaper than traditional air defense missiles, and so have been helping to intercept more of those Shaheds, and also, of course, the Russian observation drones nearer the front lines, so the Zalas and the Orlan class observation drones. So there's been a lot of progress there. The problem is, of course, that Russia has also greatly increased its own production capacity of Shahed and as they call it, Garam class attack UAVs, and Iran continues to supply. So while Ukraine's defenses are more capable and more sustainable from an ammunition point of view than they were against both cruise missiles and UAVs than they were maybe a year ago, Russia is also firing a great deal more Shahed and Garans. And of course, for ballistic threats fired by Iskander or by the MiG-31Ks with the Kinjal missiles, only Patriot really provides meaningful defense there, and only over relatively small geographical areas because of the performance needed to intercept those targets. So Ukraine is continuing to have to make pretty difficult decisions about where it allocates pretty scarce Patriot battery resources around the country against those ballistic threats. And of course, the power infrastructure is one area that's quite regularly targeted alongside air bases and industry. So yeah, there's been progress, but Russia is continuing to increase its production, and I think the outcome of that campaign against Ukrainian infrastructure remains in the balance. So it's also heartening to see such fantastic work being done by both Ukrainians and international partners on repairing facilities that have been struck, power facilities, and also increasing the capacity through interconnectors of the Ukrainian grid to be supplied by external power stations outside of Ukraine in the rest of Europe.
And do you expect Russia to use intercontinental ballistic missile against Ukrainian targets?
Well, they've done it before. If you class the Oreshnik as an ICBM, it's right on the border in range terms between an IRBM and an ICBM. Functionally, it probably makes little difference. The thing I would stress about the Oreshnik is, yes, Russia may fire another one or more. At the moment, they don't have many missiles, assuming that is indeed a development of the now defunct RS-26 development program that never produced a large number of missiles. And so Russia doesn't have a significant inventory. If it were to try and start producing them at scale, that would be taking important resources away from other missile programs, for example, resources away from Iskander 9M723 production or Kinjal production, for example. So in some ways, it's a less efficient, albeit more psychologically impressive missile system for Russia to invest in producing in large numbers. And also in its current form, it's not particularly accurate because it was a weapon system designed around nuclear warheads. And so it didn't need a huge amount of terminal accuracy. If they're using conventional warheads, as they did with the strike in Dnipro, it's psychologically impressive, but not particularly useful against point targets. Unless they get lucky. And it's a very expensive way to try and get lucky.
Let's cover also Ukraine's integration of F-16 jets into the Ukrainian air defense system. As in December last year, Ukrainian pilot on F-16 jet has successfully intercepted 6 Russia's cruise missiles for the first time in the history of the air defense battle in intercepting such air threats. What is your take on that?
Well, that's certainly, if the 6-in-1 sortie is correct, it's certainly a very impressive feat of pilot skill. it's not an easy task with the radar that the APG-66V2 radar that those F-16s have, to pick out relatively low radar cross-section cruise missiles flying relatively low altitude against ground clutter and presumably at night. So it's a significant cockpit workload, and so it's an impressive feat of airmanship. It's the sort of thing that I think one would expect to see the F-16s doing quite a lot of. And of course, the Ukrainian Air Force has also employed MiG-29 quite a lot in this role of trying to intercept cruise missiles and Shaheds inside Ukrainian airspace. The reason why I think it's not necessarily surprising that that's the main task that we're seeing the F-16s doing for now is that the threat against the F-16 platforms and any other combat aircraft platforms, if they try to operate very close to the front lines, is still extremely high from Russian ground-based air defense systems and fighter patrols on their side of the lines. So, the F-16 is certainly a significant upgrade for Ukrainian pilots in terms of particularly their situational awareness and therefore, in theory, their survivability. It has a much more capable radar warning receiver and essentially defensive aid system than the MiG and Sukhoi aircraft that it's replacing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to kind of win air superiority near the front lines or anything, because you would need a very concerted air campaign to do that with a far greater number of aircraft and weapons and a lot more support assets than I think probably the Ukrainian Air Force can currently support. So yeah, I think it's very encouraging to see the results they've been achieving in internal missile defense interceptions, and I think that's probably the best use for them at the moment, given the risks they face near the front lines and the fact that also this initial cadre of pilots who have converted successfully to the F-16 and are operating in Ukraine will be vital to give experience to and act as leaders within the units to the larger numbers of new pilots who will start to come into service from those international training programs through the mid and later parts of this year, most likely. So it's kind of important that those initial pilots are not killed essentially in high-risk operations. And of course, it was deeply tragic to see Moonfish crash quite early on. So all the more essential to limit the risk to that initial cadre of pilots to enable them to act as the baseline for training more Ukrainian F-16 pilots as they come into service.
And from your perspective, how many F-16 jets Ukraine would need to achieve air superiority on the ground? And would Ukraine also need some more sophisticated air assets?
I don't think F-16 can deliver air superiority for Ukraine near the front lines, at least not without kind of unrestricted access to the entire sort of advanced American standoff weapon arsenal and a huge amount of enabling capability in terms of targeting and electronic warfare support. Even then, it would be difficult, just because while the Russian Air Force is not enormously tactically capable, they do operate technically highly capable aircraft in many cases. So the Sukhoi 35, for example, is by most metrics significantly more capable in an air-to-air sense in terms of its radar performance, its electronic warfare performance, and its missile effective missile range with the R-37 compared to AMRAAM variants. And they have a lot more of them than Ukraine could possibly be given and support. And that's just one element of Russia's fighter fleet before you get into the AWACS, the ground-based air defense network, all the other different fighter fleets, potentially Su-57 and other things. So I think important to keep the ambition realistic in terms of building up the F-16 force and potentially Mirage and maybe even later on Gripen to enhance Ukraine's ability to provide a deterrent to the Russian Air Force trying to gain a more aggressive posture and actually push further into Ukrainian-held territory, because the F-16s should be able to provide a significant deterrent there. And also, of course, as we've seen so far, to provide an additional amount of capacity for intercepting cruise missiles and Shaheds. But air superiority near the front lines, I think, is probably too difficult to achieve at this stage for the foreseeable future.
Also, let's cover possible negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. US President-elect Donald Trump says that the war could be settled within 6 months. He also said that he is ready to reach to enforce a ceasefire deal, to reach a ceasefire. Do you believe that a ceasefire could be reached in Ukraine within this year?
Well, firstly, that depends very, very strongly on what the Trump administration decides to actually do, beyond simply stating a desire to negotiate some sort of end to the war. Put bluntly, the Russians are currently slowly on a winning trajectory, albeit taking enormous losses. And so, given that Russia has taken somewhere in the region of 800,000 casualties, so killed and wounded, seriously wounded, of whom around 300,000 are dead, more than 3,000 tanks, about 120 aircraft, 130-ish helicopters, those sort of losses are both a testament to the success Ukraine has had defending itself, but also a testament and a warning about Russia's resolve. They haven't really changed their aims. In fact, if anything, their stated aims have slightly hardened, and certainly continue to essentially revolve around a removal of the democratic Ukrainian government, guarantees of no security integration with the West, all of the 4 oblasts which they falsely claim are part of Russia, 2 of which are mostly held by Ukraine. So, these are demands which are not indicative of an immediate desire to compromise. But bluntly, because they are currently on a winning trajectory, having taken all these losses, they would have to be threatened with something credible and fairly serious for them to have any serious incentive to stop at this stage. And we've seen Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov and others repeatedly state in the last few weeks and month or so that they are not interested in any deal that freezes the front lines. And so for the incoming Trump administration, essentially they face a fairly stark choice, part of which is a trap of their own making, because in order to gain political points within the US election, they made it sound as if for their supporters it would be easy to kind of resolve the Ukraine conflict. Whereas, of course, as Ukrainians know very well, it's not easy at all. And so either they would have to accept essentially a catastrophically bad deal to get the Russians to agree to anything, which would probably involve the loss of significantly larger amounts of Ukrainian territory and lots of parts of the Ukrainian key defense lines, which would then also leave Ukraine extremely vulnerable to a renewal of Russian aggression in the short term. And, unless it included sort of Western troops on the ground, which I think is probably politically unlikely at this stage. And again, the Russians wouldn't accept unless you forced them. So you would then probably see a fracturing politically in Ukraine, as well as a fracturing politically in the West over who's to blame. Essentially, a lot of blame towards America, and the Trump administration would be saying, well, the Europeans didn't pull their weight and all of that kind of stuff. So it would leave the door open for essentially a catastrophic Russian renewal of the aggression. The alternative, therefore, for the Trump administration is essentially to double down on support to Ukraine. And if they do that, in theory, because Donald Trump doesn't really seem to have any particular ideological kind of position or commitments, he's very ruthlessly self-interested and routinely completely changes his ideologically apparent position from one month to the next, depending on what he seems to think is in his best interests. So it is possible that he looks at this trap and says, well, a catastrophically bad deal in Ukraine that very quickly leads to a further unraveling and a disaster is a bad thing for me, Donald Trump, at the start of my new administration. I don't want that. Therefore, I will have to double down and actually indicate that I'll provide much more long-term support to Ukraine with fewer caveats than the Biden administration. If that is the course that they take, which at the moment looks very politically unlikely, but on the other hand, might be actually more likely if once they start to look at their own self-interest in terms of second-order effects of any deal, then I think the Russians might have an incentive to negotiate seriously within 6 months to a year. Because if the Ukrainian position becomes more sustainable, let alone if they're starting to actually take back territory, then at some scale, then the Russians don't see necessarily in that scenario a path to victory, and therefore all the losses and all the costs starts to perhaps become less bearable for the Kremlin. I think any very short-term deal is likely to be on very poor terms for Ukraine and lead to probably very bad outcomes fairly shortly after, because of the strength of the Russian position at the moment. Whereas I also think the Trump administration does have it in its power when it comes in to create a situation by doubling down on support where within 6 to 12 months, there might actually be some chance of a serious, acceptable negotiated solution, which would still involve compromise, but it's a difficult one. The other thing, though, to note is that it's not all about what the United States and other Western partners in Europe do. Their support is irreplaceable and essential, but the Ukrainian side also has to sort out the current issues with the mobilization and training and induction of new soldiers into units really not keeping pace with losses, because Western partners can't really sort out that issue. And of course, it's incredibly difficult. But even if Western support redoubles, let's say the Trump administration doubles down, if Ukraine can't basically significantly increase the number of new trained troops who are joining formations each month to replace attrition, then it will still potentially lose. It's both on the Western side and on the Ukrainian side that that there's a need to increase the efforts and effectiveness of current policy. The current trajectory is not a particularly good one.
Thank you, Professor Bronk, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank
Thank you very much.